Hello everybody, Weegee here, and let's talk about episode 8 of Ice Queendom, Where You Belong, an episode that marks the beginning of the climax of the show. After an unnecessary 2-minute recap of the episode, like seriously I'm not sure why this was here, the show has actually been pretty good about keeping the recaps short, with the actual episode starting with Yang, Blake, and Rwby talking about how to deal with the statue, with Blake suggesting that they need to get inside so the statue can't reach them. Rwby comes up with a plan saying that she will go in and set up a door for the other two. Yang doesn't agree with this plan, seeing it as too reckless for her sister. Then Rwby tells her to stop treating her like a child, and Blake tells Yang to trust their leader. So the plan set, Yang and Blake distract the statue while Rwby gets in. I love this scene as it both shows us that Rwby is starting to gain confidence as a leader, as she quickly and confidently devises a plan for her team to get inside, a plan that actually uses the team's strength to their advantage. Rwby's semblance lets her maneuver the best, so she would have the easiest time getting inside the quickest, while Blake and Yang's semblances are better suited for distracting, with Blake being centered around evading hits and Yang being a tank. This scene also shows that Yang has indeed taken Weiss's words to heart about babying Rwby, and not letting her kinda grow up. In this scene we see Yang step back and let Rwby take the lead. She's letting Rwby do something that is dangerous, where all she can do is have faith in her little sister that she can get it done. She's loosening that overprotective grip so that Rwby can spread her wings better and grow into her own person, like a parent does with a child. Because in a lot of ways, that's how Yang treats Rwby. Their relationship in a lot of ways reminds me of Katara and Sokka's from Avatar, just actually older, younger. We then cut to the tiny Weisses and robots running amok, before they start getting captured by the Nicholas statue. Weiss herself and her father turn into a giant knight similar to the Armageddus, but not. Unlike the Armageddus, which seems to bear a resemblance to the armor worn by her grandfather, who as a summon becomes a sort of guardian knight for Weiss, the knight her father has become bears a much more intimidating appearance, with his helmet resembling an Oni mask, a Japanese yokai or demon. We get a quick scene with Shion, where we learn just how dire the situation is. Weiss's heart has started resisting the change, and if they can't get Weiss to accept this change, she will lose the ability to wake up. Meaning if she doesn't change, she will die. Back to the dream world, and we see what at first seems like one of the most disturbing things in the show as the giant Weisses expand and explode back into tiny Weisses. Yeah, at first when I saw this I was like, what the actual fuck? Did they just blow up these Weisses? That's dark. Her childhood desire is destroyed. But upon closer look, they are just turned back into their tiny forms. A symbol of Weiss getting control once again over her childish desires, before once again locking them up. Then we see Weiss and her knight father take down the out-of-control Ren and Nora, before also sending them back to the jail. She comments here how she wants them to remain pure, so I guess there was merit to what Ren and Pure were saying. Her mind created these jails so that the Grimm couldn't taint those memories and feelings. Also, there's something really fitting about her father being one of the people forcing her desires to be locked up, and doing it unlike her grandfather's statue in a much more violent fashion, by cutting them down. Back once again to Team Rwby, and they have successfully made it into the castle with Rwby's plan. Yang is quick to congratulate her, but Rwby is in this more serious mode, saying there's still a lot more work to be done, again demonstrating that she can be the leader that Team Rwby needs, that she can become a leader that Weiss can be proud of. She's growing up right in front of our eyes. They get back to the snake and Rwby pulls out the gold relic, using it to untie the snake. I wasn't really a fan of that. I think it should have been Yang that used the relic that represents her. Like, if they're going to have these 4 relics that represent a different member of Team Rwby, why not have them only be usable by that member, thereby placing more importance on the other 2 members of Team Rwby. Though mostly Yang, as again she's felt like almost a side character in this show. It would have been cool if Rwby tried to use the gold relic, but it didn't work. This would lead to some confusion, with Yang coming over, triggering the relic to glow, where Rwby then has a realization and hands it to Yang, telling her to try, and it works. Blake could then comment that Weiss really does care about both sisters, and be a little sad that she doesn't seem to be as important to Weiss, as she doesn't have one. This could have been a sweet moment that showed how Weiss feels about Yang. I feel like they dropped the ball a little bit with the relics, though a scene later in the episode shows another importance of the relics, but we will get to that later. The show switches back over to Jean and Pyrrha, who are both trying to hide from Weiss, but are quickly found. Jean then declares he will wake up Weiss, but is swiftly defeated and sent back to the silly jail, which was great. Like, yeah, what did you think was going to happen, John? You couldn't beat Cardin in the fight. How did you think you would fare against a superpowered Weiss? Then, in a moment resembling the Weiss and Jean scene from Volume 1, Pierre falls right on top of Jean's back, when sent back to the jail. Jean tries to escape the jail through the door, but then the nightmare vines begin to overtake the jail. He runs to the tree that he found the relic in, only to find that it too has been covered by these vines. And we learn another function of these relics within Weiss's heart. They protect the places that Weiss holds dear to her heart, as after this scene we get a shot of the vines overtaking the dorm that held Yang and Rwby, the dorm that they found Ruby's relic in. This also means that I was definitely right about festivals having a much deeper importance to Weiss, outside of her love of organization. It seems when these relics are removed, though, it also allows the nightmare to infect Weiss's most important memories, the ones she wanted to remain pure. So in the last video, I said that Yang's relic being in the jail was because Weiss viewed Yang as someone who could handle Weiss's childish desires. Well, I think I was on the right track, but not completely right. It wasn't that she thought Yang could handle them, it was that she thought that Yang could protect those childish desires, much like she did with Rwby, as despite all the things that Rwby has been through, she still holds on to the child inside. Rwby's relic being in the dorm means that the dorm holds a lot of importance to her, and that Rwby's friendship is likely what is protecting that specific memory. Jean manages to open a door to the train station area, where he leads Pierre and the tiny Weisses to the train, but not before one of the Weisses gets got by the nightmare. In a sad moment, poor tiny Weiss. Getting into the train, the nightmare Grimm is unable to follow them due to Jean's sword being stuck in the top of the train, meaning that Jean's sword serves a similar function to the relic. I don't think this has anything to do with Weiss herself, it's most likely that being affected by the Grimm gave Jean some sort of ability to bring a defense against it from his prior experience, in this case what appears to be a symbol of his family. Back with Team Rwby, and they have once again made their way to the auditorium, where the Grimm is, and we once again see Weiss's gown, but it appears to be more frayed than before. I'm assuming this is reflecting how the dream world is falling apart, and Weiss is inching closer to her death. Yang rushes forward but is pulled into a glyph. Weiss then proceeds to come out of said glyph, and a battle ensues, and Blake manages to actually injure the Grimm before she too is pulled into a glyph, leaving Rwby as the last fighter. Rwby manages to avoid an attack by Jacques, but drops the gold relic, and we see what makes this Grimm so dangerous, and the exact reason why Xian told them to avoid the vines. It's something that I mentioned offhand in one of my videos. As we get a close-up on Rwby's hand, we see the same vines that are on Weiss on Rwby's hand. This Grimm can infect other huntsmen by injuring them with their vines, and that makes me love this Grimm even more, as it makes it even more terrifying to deal with. It also gives it a similarity to one of my favorite Grimm, the Chill, from the Grimm fairy tales, which also infects people through touch. Weiss picks up the relic and actively destroys this one, unlike the last time where the vines destroyed it, meaning that Weiss is inching closer to accepting her eternal sleep. Rwby meets up with Jean and they make their way back to the train. But before Jean can explain what is going on, we cut to the outside of the Empire where we catch up with Yang and Blake, who are standing outside a really disturbing looking house, which we'll talk about later as the show immediately cuts back to Rwby and Jean. They talk about how Weiss's childhood feelings aren't meant to be set free, and that she had them locked up because that's what you need to do when you become an adult. Locking them away keeps her life from going out of control. We see the mark on Rwby's hand start to expand before she passes out, with her negative emotions and self-doubt about her ability to be a good leader overcoming her, letting the Nightmare Grimm ensnare her in its vines. This happens quite fast. It hasn't even been that long since she was infected. So this either shows how bad Rwby is at controlling her feelings, or shows us just how resilient Weiss is, how good she is at keeping a lid on her shit. But Rwby's more open emotion will let her escape her dream a lot easier than Weiss. This scene also gives us a bit of a flip the script moment, with Rwby talking about how great Team Juniper is, and that Team Rwby in comparison is an embarrassment. It's reminiscent of a scene in the original show, where Rwby gives Jean some advice about being a team leader during the Jean vs. Cardin arc. I like this change. It makes sense that with the wildly different upbringings, that Team Rwby would have a much harder time melding as a team than Team Juniper, which is filled with people who are a lot more affable. Outside of his confidence, Jean's rise to being a good leader would have been much easier than Rwby's, as he doesn't have to deal with strong personalities like Rwby does. Ren, Nora, and Pure are pretty easygoing characters as far as following orders goes, so having Rwby being envious of that makes a lot of sense. This is also one of the more emotional scenes in the show. You can really feel Rwby's regret at not being able to understand Weiss, at her inability to be a good leader. The one thing I don't agree with is that I don't think Jean is entirely right about Weiss needing to keep her childish desires under lock. As while it is true that you need to keep your childish emotions in check, you can't lock them away like Weiss has, as that will lead you to being more emotionally unavailable like we see with Weiss in the show. I think this show will end with Rwby and Weiss finding a middle ground, with Rwby being more mature and not acting on every childish desire, and Weiss accepting her more childish desires and learning to be looser with her emotions, as we see in Volume 2. The next scene, we are back to Yang and Blake, where we see our final climb. And we learn that this is where Blake should be in Weiss's dream. This haunted mansion is where people not allowed in the Empire reside, i.e. the Faunus. I've racked my brain trying to figure out what this building itself is supposed to be, but honestly, I couldn't tell you. At first I thought it was Weiss's manor, but upon further research, I found that's not right. My second thought was some sort of building Weiss attributes to the White Fang, but that seems a bit much. Or maybe the house epitomizes Weiss's fear of the Faunus. That's why it appears as a haunted mansion of sorts. I can't tell you some of what the outside means though. These people on the outside are the board members and family members that the White Fang has killed. That's why they seem to be hung or in some sort of execution style settings. These animal signs are all signifiers of the White Fang, how animalistic they are, and that they are not allowed in the kingdom. Then we have this terrifying statue, which could be one of two things. Just another thing that signifies Weiss's fear and hate of the Faunus, or it could symbolize some family members of Weiss's death. Then we cut to Weiss, who is back in her office, where Klein begins to talk about an eternal sleep, for those who are true Schnees, before she willingly destroys her own relic, accepting the death that the Grimm is giving her. With the destruction of this relic, that means that if my theory of each member of Team Rwby having their own relics is right, that Blake's relic is the last one left, one that is likely in the mansion that holds the Faunus, meaning that Blake will be one of the key components to saving Weiss. Poor Yang, she got a relic and she didn't even get to use it. Then we cut back to Rwby once more, where she appears to wake up from Weiss's dream world, to a hug from Weiss, and the applause of the rest of her friends, before it gets wild and we see that Rwby is in a dream within a dream, dreamception. This is where the episode ends. So with Rwby being in a dream, what happens to Weiss? I assume that Jean is going to help Rwby out of this nightmare, or Yang and Blake are going to need to go into Rwby's dream somehow, probably by contacting Xion, so we are going to get some Inception shit in the next episode. This episode was another slower one, with it focusing more on dialogue, and setting up the climax of the season. That being said, the actual content of the character interactions were great. Seeing Rwby lament the fact that she doesn't understand what Weiss is feeling was one of the more emotional scenes that the series has had. It actually had me choked up a little bit. I liked the way they flipped the interaction with Jean and Rwby, with Team Rwby being the one struggling to understand each other, as honestly that makes a lot more sense than Team Juniper having any problems between them. On the flip side to Rwby's insecurities about Weiss, we also saw her take charge more over her team, beginning to act more like a leader. At the beginning of this episode, when she was devising a plan. Seeing the Grimm start to overtake that in which Weiss held dear was a cool and depressing visual, as we saw Weiss begin to accept the eternal sleep that the Grimm is offering her, inching closer to her own death, as we learn that Weiss doesn't have much time left. And the reveal that the Grimm can infect other people through its vine was something that I projected, and it was cool to see it come true. It makes the Grimm even scarier to think about. Though this episode wasn't without its problems, it felt a little fillery, especially the ending with Rwby falling into a nightmare as well. It feels like a way to pad out the episodes of the show so we can get that 12 episode season. Then we have the way the relics were implemented, which I already talked about. They should have made each relic specifically usable by the members in which it represents, in this case, Yang. So overall, while I had some complaints with the episode, most of which are more on the show as a whole, I'd give this episode a 7.5 out of 10. It was still pretty good. So if you enjoyed this video, give it a like and subscribe, and tell me what you thought about the episode in the comments below. Thanks for watching, Weegee out.